you desire to feel lit up and really alive from the inside out, then you have to make the choices that will light you up from the inside out. That's where your focus needs to go. That's where your thoughts need to go. That's where your choices need to go. It's not easy, but that's what you're feeding from within you. Hi, and welcome to the Heart Leader Podcast, where our heart and our mind align. I'm your host, Amber, and I'm here with Austin to dive into silencing our inner critic. And we've spent a few weeks now kind of diving in together to understand the origin story of that fun little villain that can go off inside our heads, and then exploring ways that at least a few little tools throughout. We're going to really dive into tools in another couple weeks so that we can arm ourselves in that little internal, I guess we can say, superhero battle, because we're really into superhero characters. So we can look at it in that way if we would like to. But it is an inner journey. But oftentimes what we really need to understand is the what and the why before we understand the how, so that we know what we're up against. And that's really what we're doing here in these first few weeks. We're laying that framework. So if you would like to continue on this hero's journey with us, take a moment right now, and wherever you are listening, hit the subscribe button so that you don't miss an episode. It lets us know that you are on this journey with us, and you can ask us questions wherever you are so that in these podcasts we can answer them. And if you have feedback for us that you would like to see in the book, Silence Your Inner Critic, it's a great way to make sure that we get it. So this week we are diving into the different ways that that inner critic can get a strong hold and start to really impact our mental, our emotional, and our physical well-being. Because so often we think that, it's just that annoying inner voice. And what does it matter, right? It's like that little gnat that starts to bug us when we're outside and we're like, go away. But it's not that easy. It really starts to erode inside and get to different capacities of our overall health and our overall well-being. And we want to start talking about that because, as we keep saying, awareness is very important, because once we're aware, we can do something about it. And the first area we want to talk about in that awareness is our mental and emotional health. And we will divide them out as we go along, but we're going to focus on a caveat that kind of spans both of them, and that's your self-esteem. And how that inner critic can really begin to erode that self-esteem. And so first, let's talk about what self-esteem is to us, because we always talk about that communication foundation. Let's make sure everybody is on the same page with what self-esteem is. So Austin, what's self-esteem to you?
I'm going to go with Kanye's quote and say that self-esteem is the steam that powers your dreams. Yeah, I love it. It's just so clean and simple and straight to the point. And yeah, it really is. It is the steam. It's our steam within ourselves that can really power us forward, which is what I love that he brought. It was very uplifting in the way that he approached it in his lyrics. But it also, when we're lacking that steam, it's kind of like a steam-powered engine, right? It's when we're lacking the steam, it's really hard to push forward. And it feels like an uphill battle, and it feels like you're just cranking through and barely getting it. And so that's where the more that you can uplift your self-esteem, the greater your engine can go.
Yeah, exactly. Like if we are sitting in a place where we are doing the Jim Carrey and Liar Liar, and we're kicking our own backsides over and over. And that's what plays in my head sometimes. Do I really want to be in a bathroom kicking my own backside over and over, or which is my self-esteem and my inner critic basically locked in a battle in my own mind? Or do I desire to be truthful with myself at all times and feed my self-esteem knowing that I can handle anything if I just go forward and go for it? And so we're, what is it you call us, avid cinematic adventurers?
Yes.
So we watch quite a few movies. And when you find something like that, when you find a movie that triggers something within you and you can hold on to that and use that as your visualization technique. And for me, the movie Liar Liar does that a lot because there are all these little scenes in there. It gives me that fuel to go, yeah, I'm going to step out and into my own inner world and be honest with myself all the time. And so my self-esteem builds through that because I know that I can show up authentically wherever I am because I know the truth within myself. So to me, that self-esteem is knowing that I have the strength to be my authentic self everywhere I go.
Per usual, was very eloquent. And yes, I agree. That was well said, my love. Beautifully said.
It's hard to be Kanye, though. I mean, come on.
Yes, that was that whole. Anyways, self-esteem is something that we hear about, but I don't feel like it's something that we like. We understand it's there, but I don't know if there's a lot of. I don't see a lot of practices like, hey, here's what you do to build your self-esteem. Usually it's around self-worth or self-confidence or kind of all these other words that are like it, but not exactly the same. And so I think it's important that we kind of highlight some of the differentiation as you're doing with self-esteem versus self-worth and confidence and how they all play a part in our esteem. And so, yeah, I'm glad we're really exploring that today.
And when it does come to our mental and our emotional well-being, it is important to understand these little caveats because they come together as puzzle pieces. And if any one of them are not a fit, then it starts to cause some of that erosion too, because it does open that gateway again for that inner critic. And I do picture my inner critic. Like, this is one of the questions we got asked. It's like, is it that this inner critic is seen as this external, internally, but this little external character almost? And for me, I do view it that way because it's not like it's working with me and for me. It is almost as though it is this external part of myself that is almost, how can I pull you away from yourself instead of helping me integrate more into myself? So I do talk about the inner critic almost as though I know it's a part of who I am. Don't get me wrong. I 100% understand this is my own voice feeding me. But when I can do that separation factor and observe it as an observer, almost as though it is a separate part of me, then I can begin to understand it from a different perspective. And so, yes, in many ways, and you'll see this throughout the book, the inner critic is referred to almost as a third person because it gives us that opportunity to look at it from the observer standpoint, almost like a character in a story. And that's why. So, as we're talking about self-esteem, and that is the erosion of it in what we're going to talk about, it's really important to understand how the inner critic starts to get in there and erode away at that. And one of the ways we can do that, again, is through creating it like a third person, right? Going back to the movies and cinematic adventuring, either we've experienced it in our own life or we've seen it in a movie or a television show or something. This individual who takes such amazing joy out of pointing out every other person's mistakes. Like, that's their fuel. That's what they love to do. It kind of gives them a purpose somehow. If I can point out every other person's mistakes, then I have done something well. And what that invokes, at least in me, and what I see the response and hear the response back from others is, I want to create distance from that person, right? Because it begins to make you feel like nothing you do will ever be good enough. And you can literally feel it start to suck away any ounce of self-esteem. We'll go into the self-confidence. You start questioning everything, and your motivation starts to do things when this person is around starts to diminish. And you're like, why do I even bother? This person's not going to be happy with anything I do. What's the joy in doing anything when I'm around this person, right? And so it's really good for anybody writing a movie or anything else, because this is a perfect antithesis type character. But in your everyday world, it's the person who sucks the joy out of everything. So what do you do when that is your own internal critic, your own internal voice? What is that going to do to you? And how quickly is that going to suck your motivation for doing anything?
How do you stop making your inner critic a dementor, keeping you in Azkaban?
And for anybody who has no idea what that is,
Harry Potter stuff. Yeah. I think that's such a great point, because it's so clear and visceral when it is someone outside of ourselves that is that critical of us. You're right. We just want to push them away and just be like, I don't even want to be around this person. But when it is ourselves, it's almost like we're completely unaware. And so that's a really good point, is just saying it's important for us to take that time and bring that self-awareness to how we're communicating to ourselves. Are we being that person that we don't enjoy being around? Are we being that to ourselves?
Yeah.
Great point.
And then as we're doing that, we have to understand, are we in any ways taking our internal experience and then laying that out onto other people? Right?
Yeah.
We don't realize sometimes that what we're internally experiencing, suddenly we make an external experience as well. And without that level of self-awareness, the erosion of our own self-esteem through the inner critic can then begin to leak out onto other people. And that's not exactly the focus of what we're doing here, because we want to get to the root. And we really, really, really desire to understand our own emotional well-being as a result of this, and our own mental clarity. But as a result of cleaning up our own house, our own internal, we might find that our relationships are stronger, because the habits that we're forming from having lower internal self-esteem and then clearing that up and becoming more motivated and more aware will suddenly cause us to not be placing our own beliefs of ourselves out onto other people. So, for example, if my inner critic is constantly telling me I'm not capable of cooking well, and that I always mess it up and I always burn myself, and then somebody else comes into my kitchen, I'm going to have a fear that they're going to burn themselves and that they might not be capable, because I'm not capable of it. And so I don't want somebody else. So even though it's a loving thing, I don't want them to burn themselves, and I don't want them to cut themselves with a knife. So I'm going to be overly cautious, because my self-esteem is so low in this area. And so I'm going to be hovering over them, and I'm going to be, don't do that. You're going to cut yourself. You're going to hurt yourself. You're going to burn yourself. And not because I don't believe that they're a capable person, my self-esteem is so low that it's just actively and outwardly going out toward them.
Mm.
And so we might not catch these things, but it impacts then the people around us. But then the moment I find my own knowing and my own willingness to go forward, like even if I have a moment of fear, not only do I have the confidence in my skill set, but I also have the steam, as you said, to just have the motivation to go for it with that confidence, then I'm going to stop feeling like other people lack that same thing. And I'll give them the space and the grace to do it.
Mm-hmm.
Does that make sense?
Oh, yeah, absolutely. That's really nice.
So
it makes a lot of sense because I feel like that's something, whether it's that exact situation or something similar, people can really relate to, because we do place our fears on other people. And I think that ties really well to last week's episode about self-limiting beliefs, right?
Yeah.
Sometimes we don't realize that the limits we have in ourselves actually stem from the inner critic of other people. And then that just fuels our inner critic. And then it just becomes this cycle. It's like, what are we feeding? We're going to feed something.
Mm-hmm.
And so if that can fuel ourselves negatively or positively, that's becomes a more conscious choice. And the more consciousness and awareness and intention we bring to it, then the more that it can fuel what we actually desire versus being, and I'm saying this purposely, controlled by it.
Yeah.
Because it's this perception, right? That we don't have our own direction over our thoughts, our actions, our beliefs, all of that. It's in an overwhelming world where there's so many different things. It feels like we don't, because there's so much coming from outside of us, into the inside, and it's like it's overwhelming to be like, how do I even manage all of those different things, all those different people's thoughts, and the shoulds, and the woulds, and the coulds, and all those. It's hard.
Yeah, it is. And I feel like that's why it's important that we focus on the word erosion as well, because it's not like it happens all at once. And when we talked about like the gnat,
Mm-hmm.
we say that because it feels annoying, right? Like in the moments that these things start to happen, whether it's externally or internally, it's like a small little thing that happens and it's a fleeting moment. And we're like, oh, that just was annoying. Whether it's our own internal critic that the voice is popping up and it's going, and we're just like, oh, as you said, it's like an embodied thing. And so it's constantly chatter in the background and it just feels like an annoying thing that's happening. Or whether it's an external input that happens, and maybe it is that person and we get that distance from them.
Mm-hmm.
And we're like, man, they just constantly point out everything that I do that is wrong, whether it's a friend or a family member or someone. And so we don't realize that over each experience and over each inner critic monologue that just goes on like a filibuster in our minds, it's just slowly eroding away at our mental framework about ourselves.
Mm-hmm.
And emotionally, we're like a punching bag.
Mm.
And it's just like, and yeah, we're emotionally made to take a few hits, but over time, man, we are just getting broken down and broken in, not only from what's happening outside, but what we're doing to ourselves inside. Mm-hmm. And if we don't have tools and resources to reinforce ourselves and to pause, if not mostly halt the cycle, then over time, we're just going to break down and break in.
It's a good point. It's so important to realize that, especially when so much of our communication feels like it's lashing out of everyone's inner critic, like the internet in many ways. social media, when we deal with that every day, it tends to feel like everyone's inner critic is just going crazy. And like you said, pointing out everyone's little faults and mistakes. And there's like full news channels and publications that are centered on pointing out everyone's mistakes. And the problem is that people are eating it up.
Yes.
And that's where it's kind of our opportunity to readjust that, shift that type of clickbait, if you will.
Yes.
And reframe it to like, hey, we're all going to make mistakes. And is that really the fuel that we want powering our choices as a collective?
Yeah.
What about the self-esteem, not just as the individual, but what about the self-esteem of the collective of humanity? What is the steam that's going to power the dreams of humanity? Is it going to be negative? Is it going to be positive? What do we really want?
Yeah.
And our actions show us that, but we tend to just brush it off. And we don't like it when it happens to us, but we're fine if it happens to someone else. And until we really make that jump into recognize that when it's happening to someone else, it's also happening to us, that's the next step of evolution for us, I feel. When we can do that, and then we can start to recognize that self-esteem is not just individual, but is collective as well.
I absolutely love that statement. Going with the cinematic adventuring that we have, there was the movie Tomorrowland.
Yes.
Yes.
That's what I was thinking with the which one is it going to feed?
Yes. Do you want to talk about that?
I did, but I couldn't remember the full.
So it's talking about
dogs,
the wolf.
Right? The wolf, yeah.
The wolves. There's the dark and the light,
Yes.
which, dark, light, it's just a way to differentiate, right?
Yeah.
I would offer from my perspective, we often make things very black and white, and it's very shades of gray.
Mm-hmm.
But they talk about there's a dark and a light wolf, right? And it's all about what do you feed? Mm-hmm. That's where it's what are you looking at? Both will always be there. It's just a matter of what are you going to feed? Which wolf are you going to feed? And that is what your experience is going to be. Mm-hmm. And so if you desire to feel lit up, and that's how I took it from this film, right? If you desire to feel lit up and really alive from the inside out, then you have to make the choices that will light you up from the inside out. That's where your focus needs to go. That's where your thoughts need to go. That's where your choices need to go. It's not easy, but that's what you're feeding from within you. If you desire the dark, which is more about the heavier denseness or just not seeing more than anything, then those are the choices that you make, right? And that's what you feed. Either way, it's just choosing. Mm-hmm. And you can choose again. You can choose different. If you've chosen to feed the dark wolf and then you choose to feed the light, then choose that. It doesn't matter. Mm-hmm. But as a collective whole, eventually it will matter. Right. So each of us needs to make the choice individually. But if we're all choosing the dark wolf over the light wolf, then our collective experience will show that. Mm-hmm. We all choose to feed the light one over the dark. Our collective experience will represent that. And I feel like that's what that movie was showing very well. And I appreciated that. So each of us right now are making our own individual choices. Mm-hmm. And, our inner critics are a reflection of the choices we're making.
Agreed. I'd love to explore even further when you say lift up from the light. Mm-hmm. It just reminds me a lot of a hologram. And for those who are unaware, a hologram is two-dimensional data that when light is brought into it becomes three-dimensional. So light is that third dimension, right? And so it's really neat because it's a way to actually scientifically show how light can lift up. And so when you've got two dimension, it's flat, right? But the moment that light is on it, then it lifts up and it becomes three-dimensional. And so just because technology was a huge part of Tomorrowland, and there was some holographic aspects of it, I just thought that was such a neat way that you said that, light is a way to lift ourselves up. And the reality is that there's so much science and truth behind that as well. And so when we can kind of match that and recognize that that's actually what's occurring, then it's just another way to make the metaphor really resonate on another level.
It's interesting. And over time, we'll be releasing a book called The Science of Being Human, Spirituality of Being Human, and The Science and Spirituality of Being Human. And we'll dive into how light is a particle and a wave, and how all of that intertwines. But yeah, it is very interesting. But bringing that back to how it impacts that whole self-esteem, like how can we navigate that inner critic so that it doesn't become that part of us that is that person that we know who is constantly telling us every single thing we're doing incorrectly and wearing away at us? How do we shed light on that, as you said, and help pull ourselves up out of that? If we recognize what is happening, we know how it's happening. The next thing is, what do we do about it?
Good point. I would say that another reference to dark and light is that when it's dark, you're saying it's unseen.
Yes.
So that to me is another reference for unawareness.
Yep.
Lack of awareness of our own. So when we are in that darkness, if you will, we can't see what's going on. We can't recognize our own actions, and we become unaware or unconscious in our actions. When things are light, we can actually start to see things, just like in a room, right? It's dark, you don't know where everything is. And when you turn the lights on, it's like, oh, I can see everything in the room. And so when we are bringing light into our actions, we're starting to bring awareness. We're starting to see all aspects of ourselves. And that it's not criticism to pull ourselves down, but it's, as we talk about, opportunities for expansion, opportunities for growth, a way for us to just become a better version of ourselves, recognizing that we all make mistakes, and we're always going to make mistakes. It's how we learn. It's not going to be, if it was just perfect all the time and there were no mistakes made, then we weren't learn anything, and then this would be really boring. And so there's always that room to get a little bit better. And so if we start to view the light as not criticism, but that evaluation of our actions, and say, okay, hey, this was great. Could have maybe done better, but I learned something. And I think you said that beautifully in the last episode. You really explained how important that is. And so shifting that same idea into our self-esteem. And if that's what's our feeder, almost like our esteem for our soul. If we want it to be in that same way, we're expanding and growing from that soul space, then that means that it's coming from a place of love. Yeah. And so then we aren't hurting ourselves or putting ourselves down. We're actually lifting ourselves up because it's coming from our soul, from our love, from our light, and it's lifting us up.
Yes. And as you talk about like the steam to move forward, right? Self-esteem, motivation, the knowing. It's challenging sometimes to move forward when we have yet to forgive ourselves for things that we've done. If we feel guilt or shame or fear that someone may discover something that we've done, all of those things will hold us down and hold us back. And so there are different techniques that you can do for self-forgiveness, which is a very important factor, again, for boosting that mental and emotional health. We're so prone to being harder on ourselves than we generally are to other individuals. Now, not everyone and not always. We can't make 100% generalizations. But for the most part, what we have found is that individuals are so much more willing to forgive another individual, even a stranger, than they are to forgive themselves for something they feel they have done wrong, either just an error in a general sense or to someone else, which is far harder. And so if you're looking to move forward and not just keep spinning, then you have to be willing to forgive yourself for anything that you feel you may have done in error. And that does go back to recognizing the learning opportunity and recognizing how you forgive others. Because if you have a way that you find it easy to forgive someone else, turn that inward. Allow yourself to forgive you for anything that you may have done. Because in truth, you can't undo it. It's already out there. So there's no magic genie that's going to come and put that back in the bottle, no matter how much we want it to. It's just done. And so you're not going to be able to live your full life until you find a way to say, what's done is done. And all I can do from this moment forward is make new choices based on what I gained from that choice. And by forgiving yourself, any apology that you make feels far more sincere. Otherwise, it's coming from a feeling of I messed up instead of I learned something. And so when we can find it within ourselves to say, I fully embrace that I made a mistake as a human being, and I own that mistake fully and completely, and I forgive myself for that mistake fully and completely. And these are, as you said, the lessons I'm taking from that mistake as I move forward so that I do not step in that same puddle again. Then I can apologize to you if I have somehow caused you pain or issue in that mistake. And I can say, Austin, I am really sorry for what I did. This is what I've learned from it. And this is how I will make certain that I don't impact your life in that way again.
Yeah, it's powerful.
Right? And now I feel a lot more empowered because I have a plan to not hurt somebody I care about again.
And I feel like when I hear something like that, as you said, it's sincere, it's authentic, it's real, and I can actually see that it's not just words for words' sake or just action just to appease me, but it's something that actually you could tell there's a physical embodiment of the shift within the self.
Yes.
And you can't deny that at that point. Then it's on me.
Yeah. And so it's growth all the way around.
Yeah.
Talk about steam.
Yeah. Right. Forgiveness is the high test fuel for self-esteem.
Yeah.
and I love what you said of just recognizing, well, maybe taking that step back and recognizing, well, what am I really good at? Am I a great best friend? Am I really good at listening? Am I really good at forgiving people when I really genuinely feel that, they understand they made a mistake? What are all these things that I'm good at towards others? And how do I start to be that to myself? And I feel like that's a really good place to start when building one's self-esteem. Because then you're providing all that positivity, that fuel, and you're not doing anything that you don't already know how to do. You're just redirecting, as you said, back into yourself. And oftentimes, let me restate. It's hard to give something that we don't already have. And so instead of attempting to say, well, I don't know where to start. I don't even know where to I don't know how to help myself. When you're starting from a place where you're already helping others in that same way, then you can give yourself something you already have.
Right. It's a skill that you feel very adept in.
Yes, exactly. And so I feel like we definitely we definitely underestimate how important it is to be our own best friend.
Yes.
And that'll be continuing talk through this whole series of silencing our inner critic.
Mm-hmm.
And it's reframing this inner critic in a way to be in alignment with us being our best friend.
Yeah.
And then it becomes a tool for us versus a weapon against ourselves for self-sabotage or anything along those lines.
Yeah. Well, and as we were saying, like for us, we know that we love movies and superheroes, and there are just certain things. Science is a big part of what I leverage. Both I am spiritual and I am scientific, and I love how they intersect and learning in that intersected space. So I know that about myself. The more you get to know who you are, then you can observe the facets of that and then internalize them and make those connections in your internal world. And that gives you that observation that is fun and uplifting. And you can have joking dialogue about it with others and yourself. But you have to understand, what do you enjoy? What is going to make this lighthearted enough for you that it doesn't feel like a drudge to do this inner exploration, this inner focus? Otherwise, you're going to be like, oh, man, I know I need to silence this inner critic, but I don't feel like doing that today. So, and then your inner critic's going to go, yeah, I mean, why do we need to do that? We don't need to silence anything. So let's just, you're not going to be good at it anyway. So why would you even go for that? And then we're going to spiral down that rabbit hole. But if we find something that is fun and we connect with and it seems much more enjoyable, then we're going to embrace this. And so if superheroes and movies and all of that isn't your thing, that's perfect. Like, find what your thing is. If it's cooking, then find ways to tie this into things that you know about cooking. If it's art, whether that's painting or sculpting, find ways to tie it into that. But find something that like sparks you internally, that all of this can connect to and lights you up in the joy of the journey.
I love that. It's so good. So when we see people who are magnetic, who are charismatic and confident, it's interesting because we know the difference when it's authentic versus attempting to prove something. When it's authentic, it's coming from a place of knowing, and that knowing comes from our soul. And that means that we're not relying on something outside of ourselves to determine or fuel our inside. It's the knowing stems from pure truth, soul truth, which is unlimited in its ever expansive nature. And so when we can tap into that and embody that, well, that's what these people who are charismatic and confident and magnetic are doing. They're not letting something from outside self determine their self-worth or fuel their self-esteem in something negative. They're creating that internal cycle, but pulling from inside, which is that knowing. It's not egoic. It's not, I mean, well, for some people it could be, and there's a fine line, right? But then again, I would say if it's egoic, then it's no longer the knowing. That's proving something. And then that's wanting to be outside to in. You need to prove yourself. When it's pure knowing, it is truth.
Yeah. And when our self-esteem does take that hit,
mm-hmm.
and the inner critic just erodes it completely away, what it can do to us on an emotional and mental health standpoint is really trigger depression. If we feel like, if our motivation goes away and our zeal for life or our knowing that we can do things just really starts to fade, we become withdrawn. Our desire to emotionally connect with others begins to pull inward more. And so when we talk about there are actual implications to our well-being, these are the things that we are discussing. Yes, it's a slow process, but the more that it begins to wear away, the more it has actual implications to our health and our well-being. Mm-hmm. And so as we're seeking treatments, should we have gotten to that point, or as a preventive measure, when we can develop this awareness and we can develop these skills and these tools and this repertoire that we're offering, mm-hmm. then we can have the empowerment to shine the light and say, all right, I understand the what, the how, the why, and I'm going to develop plans to consistently, hand in hand. We're not saying don't seek the professional medical treatment by any means, but along with that, I also have this whole plethora of tools mm-hmm. that can help me, because I'm more empowered with the knowing, mm-hmm. which we can say is like shining the light into all of the dark corners, right?
Yeah, definitely. And I love that you said with the knowing. And for me, that's source. That's love. That's God, whatever you want to call it. Anyone can call it something different. But for me, that's when we are tapping into that. That's us tapping into our divine selves. I don't know a greater purpose than that. And I don't that's exactly what I'd love to see everyone do, is tap into their divine selves. Like, what a beautiful experience. What a beautiful light. I know we talk about, it's hard to express how much that I just wish everyone could see the light that they are. Every person has someone who looks at them in a way that they've never looked at themselves. So that's where this tapping into one's knowing and oneself, like, trust it. Even if it's the hardest thing in the world to do, there is no better return. And if there's anything that we can do, please comment, please reach out to us. This is why we're doing what we're doing.
I think that's a perfect place to wrap up. Thank you very much for joining us on this episode of the Heart Leader podcast, where our heart and our minds are aligning. I am your host, Amber, and I've been here with Austin as we dive into the Inner Critic. And we're doing this all around our book, Silence Your Inner Critic. And if you would like to take a moment to pre-register for the book and get 20% off along with one of our most popular workshops all around the mirror technique, then you can follow the URL, which is down below anywhere that you're listening or watching this. It's silenceyourinnercritic.com, and you can pre-register there, and we'll get that workshop right over to you via email. And we are going to continue our journey together over the next few weeks. So again, if you don't want to miss a single one, take a moment wherever you are and click that subscribe button. It helps us more than we can possibly tell you. And we look forward to seeing you in the Suivera community.